Welcome everyone to the first January Elevate HR, the first Elevate of 2025. So thanks for everybody for coming. Today we have Stephen Blackwell with us. He is the ADA coordinator for the campus, and he is going to tell us all about the ADA and how things work here at the university. So I will turn it over to Stephen.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for having me. Give me just a second. Let me share. Just a couple of things as we're going through the presentation today. I like the engagement process. So if there are questions that you have as we're going through the presentation today, please let me know. Can everybody see the ADA presentation screen? Perfect. Okay. As we're going through the presentation, I know there's a lot of people, like I said, though, if you have questions, don't be afraid to drop them in the chat and ask. Remember that this is a safe space. We are all learning today, me included. And so if you have questions, please don't be afraid to ask them. If you supervise individuals that are on the call today and they ask a question, please don't hold that against them. And the same as if your supervisor asks a question, please just keep that in mind that we are in a learning environment. And it's going to be good for all of us. So I'm hoping to learn from you. I'm hoping you'll learn from me. We're going to kind of go through the presentation today. Once I get to the end, I've got a kind of a scenario to wrap everything up. We'll go through that together. I'm going to be looking for audience participation several times throughout our conversation today. So please don't be afraid to jump in there and contribute. And then when we get to the end, I'll open it up for questions. And I'm happy to stay as long as you guys need me. So I don't expect our presentation to take the full 2-hour block, but if we end up using the remainder of that time for questions and answers, I'm happy to do that. Just keep in mind that as we're going through the presentation, if you do choose to share or you do choose to ask a question, please be cognizant of individuals' privacy. Let's not talk about specific individuals. If you have situations that you may want to talk about a specific situation, just keep in mind that sometimes we have small teams. And so while I may not say a name, someone may be able to determine who I'm talking about. So try and keep things general. If you have general questions, we can answer those. If you have more specific ones, once we're done with the presentation, you're always more than welcome to reach out and we can go from there. So the housekeeping done, let's go ahead and get started. So today we're going to talk about two different things, actually. We're actually going to talk about the ADA as well as the PWFA, so our Americans with Disabilities Act as well as the Pregnant Workers Fairness Act. But we're going to get started with our ADA. Now, I am the ADA coordinator for our employees, and that includes our faculty, staff, residents, and our fellows. However, our students are managed through the Office of Disability Access and Inclusion. So I've added two different links in here. One is for Disability Access and Inclusion. That's Lauren's group. And they'll be happy to help with any accommodation requests or information that you need about students. But when it comes to our employees and everyone else, that's primarily going to be in my wheelhouse. So what is the ADA? Fundamentally, it's a civil rights law that essentially protects disabled employees. It guarantees that our employees and applicants and other individuals who may have disabilities have the same opportunities as everyone else to enjoy employment and the benefits of employment, enjoy government services and goods, and to purchase goods and services. So it's really geared towards equity and ensuring that those individuals have equal opportunity, that as the same opportunities rather as their fully able-bodied counterparts. Now, the ADA is actually broken down into 5 different titles. There's 2 that really kind of apply to us. One of them is Title I, which governs employment. And then the other one is a title that governs kind of government, state and local government services, right? Our presentation today is going to be focused primarily on Title I, almost entirely on Title I, actually, because that's the most important things when it comes to employment. But there are other situations, like, for example, when we are giving presentations, that we might want to be mindful of those other titles, particularly the title that governs those state and local government services. We are a state agency, therefore we provide goods and services to the general public, and the ADA applies to everyone. And so sometimes we might need to keep that in mind when we're designing a class. Are we making that class accessible? If we're hosting a conference, are we opening that up for individuals? Are we reaching out to employees as part, or to attendees as part of our welcome process, or as part of our enrollment or registration process, and saying, hey, we welcome everyone, and we want to make sure that we're taking care of you. So do you have any disabilities that we might need to accommodate? I'm working on another class for that, but it's just something to think about and have in the back of your head. But today, like I said, for the most part, we're going to be talking specifically about Title I. So who does Title I protect? It's going to protect all qualified individuals with disabilities in all aspects of employment. That includes the recruiting process. And so it applies to our applicants, the hiring process, the promotion process, the training process, and pay. And it just essentially means that if we treat anyone differently in any of these areas based on their disability, we're essentially discriminated against them, and we can be held accountable for that. Okay. So I mentioned that Title I applies to qualified individuals, and the term qualified individual with a disability is actually very, very important when it comes to the ADA, because the ADA really only applies to those qualified individuals with a disability. So a qualified individual with a disability is someone who has a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities. And there are a whole host of major life activities. Things like the ability to get dressed in the morning, to take care of oneself, to bathe, to work. All of those are considered major life activities. And one of the ways that we gather this information is if we request documentation from an employee's healthcare provider, we will, as part of the ADA accommodation process, we will generally ask the healthcare provider to tell us which activities which daily activities of daily living are limited for that particular employee or applicant, as well as all the limitations that come along with that. So outside of those, having that limit on one or more major life activities, it also applies to those individuals who have a record of such impairment. So if I've been disabled in the past, and I may not be now, I still have some protections. You can't discriminate against me because I was disabled in the past, okay? I may not be anymore, but we don't generally see a lot of this. It's more geared towards the individuals with active disabilities, but every once in a while you'll have that situation where someone will say, oh, well, they had this issue in the past, and so they may have it again in the future, and so I don't want to do something with them. And then last but certainly not least is regardless of having such an impairment. They may not actually have a disability, but if you think they do, and you treat them differently, that's technically discrimination and violates the ADA. In addition to having either the disability regarded as or the things I've just mentioned, they also have to meet the legitimate skill, experience, education, and other requirements of an employment position, okay? This one is important, and this is kind of where we see this. So if I apply for a job and I know that I have a disability, and that disability is going to prevent me from performing the essential functions of that job, and I apply for it and I get it, and that I'm not able to perform, and as part of that performance management discussion, I disclose that I have a disability and need an accommodation, I may not actually be eligible for that accommodation because I was not technically qualified for that position without a reasonable or with or without a reasonable accommodation at the time that I applied, right? So again, if they have a disability that they're not going to be able to perform the essential functions, like for instance, let's say, this has nothing to do with Siri and Anschutz, but let's say I want to work on a submarine and I have a horrible fear of enclosed spaces, but I apply for the job, I get the job, come to find out I don't do real well. I can't just go to my employer and say, hey, I need an accommodation so that I can do this job, like not working on the submarine. That's not going to apply, right? The expectation is that when I applied for that job, I knew it was an essential function, but at the same time, I wasn't qualified because I knew that my disability would not allow me to do it. So that's kind of where that comes into play. And then last but certainly not least, can perform the essential functions of the position with or without reasonable accommodations, right? That's that important last part, with or without the reasonable accommodations. They don't have to be able to do it without, as long as they can do it with, we're good to go. So as we're going through, let's think in terms of, what is a reasonable an accommodation. Reasonable accommodations are nothing more than changes or adjustments to jobs or work environments that will essentially allow an applicant to participate in the hiring process or an employee to satisfactorily perform the essential functions of their jobs. Okay, and satisfactorily performing the essential functions is important. There is not going to be an expectation that we eliminate any of those essential functions or that we reduce our performance expectations of that employee as part of this accommodation. But we'll talk about that here in just a minute. But as I mentioned earlier, the key purpose of an accommodation is to allow the employee to perform the essential functions of their job and to enjoy the benefits and privileges of their employment, the same as any other employee. So now that we know kind of what an essential, a reasonable accommodation is, let's talk about some examples of reasonable accommodations. And these are the ones that we see most often on our campus. So providing or modifying devices. These are the things like, I need a different chair, or I need a different mouse, or I need a sit-stand desk, things of that nature. Those ergonomic functions are actually reasonable accommodations most of the time under the ADA. Job restructuring. Maybe I can't do this particular task this particular way, but I might be able to do it a different way. That would be an example of job restructuring. Part-time and modified work schedules. Let's say an employee has the ability, comes off of FMLA, their healthcare provider has essentially authorized them to return to work with restrictions. They can only work X number of hours. Well, if the employee doesn't have any additional FMLA available to them for intermittent work or family leave available for intermittent work, then they may apply for that part-time work as a reasonable accommodation. And we would essentially go through the accommodation, the interactive process to determine whether or not it was indeed reasonable. Remote work. This is the biggest one. This is the biggest one that we see on our campus. And we see it as a request for all sorts of different medical conditions. Remote work can be reasonable. It all depends upon the job. We'll talk a little bit more about that a little bit later. Same thing with time off, adjusting or modifying examinations, training materials, or policies, how we train people. Not everybody learns the same way, and individuals with disabilities may have some additional barriers to learning that we need to help them overcome. And so those individuals have the right to apply for that accommodation or to request that accommodation. And we have an obligation to evaluate it. Providing interpreters or closed captioning. This is something that we're required to do. If an employee asks, we will be required to provide that captioning or that interpreter, assuming that it's within the financial resources of the university. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute as well. And then last but certainly not least, making the workplace readily accessible and usable by people with disabilities. Things like how narrow are aisles in between desks? How easy is it to reach supplies in a supply closet? Those kinds of things. So sometimes individuals need a little bit of help in that area, and we're happy to help them. So what is not generally a reasonable accommodation? Well, all of those things that I said are reasonable accommodations, depending upon the impact that they have, could technically be unreasonable, but these are our things that generally are never reasonable. So removing essential job functions. We are not required under the ADA to remove an essential function. We're not required to reduce a performance expectation. We're not required to create a new job, to change an employee's supervisor or their coworkers for that matter. We're not required to provide personal items such as wheelchairs, eyeglasses, things of that nature. We don't have to give them time off without an unknown end date. And then we don't have to provide accommodations that create an undue financial or operational hardship. I'm going to touch on this one for just a little bit. And the reason being is it's very, very important to understand what a financial and an operational hardship is. A financial hardship is essentially, it's going to create a financial hardship for the unit given the resources of the university. Okay, so When an EEOC investigator comes in and looks at if an employee files a complaint and says the university wasn't willing to accommodate me, that EEOC investigator is going to come in and they're going to look at the overall resources of the university. They generally are not going to look at the fact that it was a grant funded position, the grant only provided this much money, or that this is a department that's kind of separate and apart and kind of runs things on its own and only has this much money. They're going to look at CU Anschutz as a whole. Now, we are not a super rich campus. And so sitting there and saying, oh, we expect you to pay for a $10,000 desk is probably not going to be reasonable. Okay. But when we have situations where we may need to spend $300, $400, $500, we understand that it may not be in the budget for a lot of our units. But we will generally work with that unit and their higher echelons to acquire those kinds of things. Because when we look at it in terms of the resources of the university, more often than not, it's going to be reasonable. Now, I will be the first one to tell you, I don't do this job in a vacuum. I do not have a budget to provide reasonable accommodations. Those are all managed at the unit level. Okay. How that's distributed in your unit varies. Sometimes the college may be willing to pay for it. Sometimes they say, nope, the grant's got to pay for it, which creates all sorts of new issues. But just know that when it comes to financial hardship, it's a much bigger picture, most likely, than just your individual piece of that pie. Operational hardships are considerably different. So when we're talking about an operational hardship, we're looking at what is the overall impact that this accommodation could have on the operation of our unit. Is it going to prevent us from being able to provide services? Is it going to fundamentally alter what we do? Is it going to require other individuals to sacrifice their own essential functions to help accommodate this, or to help with this accommodation? And so those things can all create operational hardships. I will tell you that is actually the most common reason that we'll deny an accommodation on our campus is due to those operational hardships. Generally, what will happen is an employee will ask for something, but the only way to accommodate that would be to either ask another employee to take on that employee's functions, or allow those functions to go uncompleted. And a lot of times when we're asking that other employee to take on those functions, as I mentioned earlier, it's going to prevent them from performing the essential functions of their own jobs, thereby creating that operational hardship. Does that make sense to everybody? North and South? Awesome sauce. All right. So how do I identify a request for accommodation? All right. I've got an idea in my head of things that are reasonable now, but what does it look like when an employee actually asks for that accommodation? And just 1 second. For whatever reason, I am not. All right. Before I go on, Kim had asked in the chat, sorry, I missed your message, Kim. So Kim asked in the chat, how about equipment for remote work locations such as chairs due to documented medical issues? So if an employee is primarily working remotely, we would essentially treat that as their home office. So if we would consider that request for their office on campus, we would probably want to consider that request for the remote location as well, because that's their place of duty. Now, if you have a hybrid employee who works sometime on campus and sometime off campus, then they're going to need to decide where they want that chair. We may purchase it for them, but they're going to decide where they want it. We probably are not going to have an obligation to purchase chairs for both places, right? All right. So moving on, in terms of requesting the accommodation, when an applicant or employee initiates the requests, it can be verbal, it can be in writing. It very rarely will ever come across specifically as a request for an accommodation where the employee says, I would like an accommodation under the Americans with Disabilities Act as amended, right? More often than not, it's going to come as an implicit request. And a lot of times it's going to come during a performance discussion. So there is no magic language that's required. So it's very important that we as HR practitioners know, and that we train our supervisors to understand that requests can take on a lot of different forms. The key is that the employee, or the applicant for that matter, simply needs to say they need something due to a medical condition. Okay, so for example, an implicit request might be something like, I've got an employee that's fell in, and they're going to come in and they're going to say, all right, well, I fell and it's hard for me to walk. Well, this employee's job is, let's say, a male employee. They're responsible for delivering the mail on campus, or for interoffice mail on campus. Well, if they can't walk, it's going to be hard for them to perform the essential functions of their job. I know that. I know that walking is an important part of their job. So as the supervisor, I should probably say something to the effect of, oh, I'm so sorry to hear that. Is that going to create an issue for you in getting your job done? Oh, yeah. Okay, well, then let's take you over to the ADA office and talk about a reasonable accommodation. Okay, so more often than not, those requests are going to be implicit as opposed to that explicit request. There are situations, in addition to employees asking, there are going to be situations where departments may need to initiate the request if all three of these criteria are met. So if an applicant or employee has a disability, it's a visible disability, we can probably see that they have it. If it's not a visible disability, maybe they've shared it with us as a supervisor. Maybe they've said, oh, I'm having these mental health issues, or I'm having this problem. If I know or have reason to know that the applicant or employee is experiencing problems because of the disability, so now we're starting to get closer to what we were talking about with that implicit request. And then last, certainly not least, if I know or have reason to know that the disability prevents the person from requesting the reasonable accommodation. Okay, so if for some reason I'm not able to ask, or I don't know to ask, there's been some recent case law around perhaps the employee just wasn't informed and didn't understand that they needed or could ask for an accommodation, and therefore I have that duty to tell them that they may be eligible for reasonable accommodation and direct them towards those resources. Okay, does that make sense? So usually the smartest thing to do is, if in doubt, don't be afraid to refer folks. We want to be kind of careful around telling people they have to reach out, though. And the reason is if we inadvertently tell an employee they have to reach out for something, and we wouldn't do that for an employee who did not have a disability, then we could be running afoul of the ADA. So if you have any questions, reach out to your supervisors, reach out to me. And I'm happy to kind of help you navigate some of those situations to determine whether or not it was a request or it's not, or you have an obligation or you don't. All right. So let's say you've gotten a request for reasonable accommodation, or you know that a supervisor has received a request for reasonable accommodation. How do they respond to that request? Well, this is where we're going to spend a little bit of time, because I kind of want to flesh this process out a little bit more, because sometimes I think that's the kind of the knee-jerk reaction is, oh, just reach out to the ADA, when in fact the ADA may not necessarily be the best option for that employee. So the first thing we want to do is we want to assess what the applicant or the employee is asking for. Are they asking for leave? Are they asking for physical accommodation that we can easily provide? Are they asking for something that we probably do need to go through the interactive process for? So that's kind of the first step in that process. The second step is considering the options available to fulfill that underlying request, right? So for instance, if I have an employee that says that they're going to be having surgery and is interested in an accommodation under the ADA, oh, you're going to be surgery, so you might be out for a while. Yeah, well, let me get you in contact with, let me give you the information about family and FMLA, because that's going to provide you with that federally job protected leave that would probably be better for you than the ADA. Okay, so just kind of assessing what those options are, providing the applicant or the employee with the appropriate resources. Don't be afraid to discuss those resources with the employer, direct them to those resource websites. I need some time off. I need a couple of days. I need to go to an appointment. We have sick leave policy for that. we have a vacation policy for that. If they might be better served when it comes to intermittent time off, where we have an FMLA award, that might be better. Direct them to those resources, and then to us if they do have those questions specifically about ADA, or if you think that the ADA would still serve their best interests. Don't be afraid to ask for assistance and consult with your HR partner or contact the ADA coordinator, which is me, at the email address. Now, I will tell you that email sometimes gets a little wonky lately. So my personal email is Stephen.Blackwell. It's Stephen with a V, .Blackwell at CUAnschutz.edu. You are always more than welcome to CC me directly on anything you send to the ADA box. I'm not saying you have to. I'm just saying that you're welcome to do that, because it just guarantees that if it doesn't go one place, it'll go the other. I've noticed with the ADA box, sometimes our Defender software is a little overzealous, and will catch those emails and say, nope, I don't like this. And they'll keep them from going into the inbox. So are there any questions from y'all specifically about this assessment and thinking through how best to respond to these requests? No.
I have a quick question.
Yeah, go for it.
So the majority of our faculty that is using FMLA and or family, right?
Yeah.
They may get to the end of their family, and for instance, they had foot surgery, right? Their doctor says that they can come back kind of like at a reduced, so not to stand on their feet. If their job is requirement is to kind of walk around, right? But they say they can't walk more than 6 hours a day.
Right.
Have I been right to start directing them to the ADA court, to you, to find accommodations to reduce their schedule?
Yeah, guys, that's a great question. And in fact, I was actually typing a response to your email you sent me yesterday, including all these things. So I'm glad you asked that question, actually. 2 reasons. 1, everyone gets the benefit of it. 2, I could not have to include it all. So a couple of things around that. 1 is, do they have sick leave? Okay. So we, for all intents and purposes, treat sick leave as job protected leave, right? And so if they're coming off of FMLA or family, they've exhausted their entitlements there, and they're not able to return to work, or they're not able to return to full duty, and the department can't accommodate their restrictions, then they may not necessarily need an accommodation if they have that sick leave balance. Okay. So if they've got the sick leave, usually the easiest thing is just to ask them to take the sick leave. I want to throw one additional caveat in there. While an employee is on FMLA or on family, we cannot require them to engage in the ADA process. Okay. So if an employee is out, we can say, hey, if you don't think you're going to be able to come back, you think you might need accommodations, you're more than welcome to reach out. If they choose not to do that, though, there's absolutely nothing we can do about it. If they do, and I send them the paperwork, the clock does not start on that paperwork until their FMLA or their family ends. Okay. But if they're on sick leave, it's a little bit different story. If they do not have FMLA and they do not have family, either they weren't eligible or they've exhausted that, and now they're just on sick leave and using their accruals, we do have the ability to ask them to engage in the process. But we generally are not going to take any type of action against them that could lead to the separation from employment or anything like that. Now, if there were legitimate performance issues before the leave or whatever that we need to address, we'll address those, and your employee relations performance partner can assist with that. But the first, back to your original question, the first step is to assess, do they have sick leave? If they do, let's generally let them take it. If they don't have any sick leave, then it's going to depend on whether or not there is that they actually are a qualified individual with a disability. As I mentioned earlier, for them to have a disability, it has to interfere with an activity of daily living. If you're able to accommodate their restrictions, because a lot of times those are finite and short term, that will not qualify as a disability. All right. So if you're able to accommodate them, there's no need for them to have an accommodation because they don't technically have a disability. But if you say you can't accommodate them, then now they do not have the ability to work, which means they may have a disability, and we would want to go through the interactive process to determine what, if anything, we can do to accommodate their restrictions. Does that make sense to everybody? I know it's kind of confusing. Okay. So again, go ahead. Hi,
I
Betsy.
have a related question.
Okay.
I guess I just want to make sure I understand. So if someone is coming back from FMLA and we get the fitness to return and they have a, in this example, they can only walk for a certain amount of time. If they're okay with that and we're okay with that, I mean, it sounds like that's fine because it's temporary, but are we required to say, if you, I mean, are we required to offer an ADA accommodation or let them know that that's an option, even if we're okay with whatever the restriction is?
Not if it does not interfere with activity of daily living. So if you're accommodating them not walking, so it's short term, the quick answer is no.
We don't have to say, if you would like something, if you don't want to be restricted and you want to see if there's an option, we don't have to offer them that.
Well, if you are able to accommodate them and
Yeah.
to come back to work, that's fine. They probably have a disability at that point because you're accommodating their restriction, and it's allowing them to work. So we've not removed that activity of daily living. Now, let's say they don't have the ability to get dressed in the morning, which is completely separate from their inability to walk around the office, then maybe we might want to discuss that. So I don't want to give a blanket answer, but I think what I would advise is reach out. Let's just kind of talk it over when you have those scenarios. And then more likely than not, you probably will not have to do the referral.
Okay, I just remember
it will not be through ADA. It'll just be complying with their work restrictions because the employee's not disabled.
Okay, I thought I remembered a case where I talked to you, an employee had a restriction and you had asked if I had offered them an ADA accommodation and I hadn't, because I just assumed, okay, this is their restriction. It didn't occur to me like, could we find another way to accommodate them? And so I took from that we have to offer someone, or at least mention that it's an option, but I understand, it sounds like it's really nuanced.
Yeah,
okay, thanks.
I probably didn't understand. I apologize. I probably didn't even understand exactly what you were or think it through.
Oh, that's okay. I just came away with maybe I just came away with a different understanding than you meant.
Yeah, no, there's no harm in doing the referrals. I mean, if we refer someone that didn't need to be referred, there's no harm done.
Okay.
At all. It's in situations where we tell an employee they have to do something.
Right.
When we may not necessarily require able-bodied individuals with that, to do the same thing in the same circumstances, that's when we start to get in trouble.
Thank you.
Go ahead. All right. So everybody clear as mud there? I know it's complicated, but like I said, don't be afraid to reach out. After we've gone through a few of them together, I'm willing to bet that you'll probably catch on pretty easily and we'll be able to just go from there.
It looks like we have a couple more in the chat.
Oh, okay. Let's see.
Employee is pregnant and does not want to take leave as she is saving her time for post-delivery. She wants to do remote work instead. Is that ADA or HR?
We're going to get to that question. So parking lot that for just a minute, Danae, if you don't mind. Let's talk about that one when we get to the Pregnant Workers Fairness Act, because it's a little.
And then does it put us at risk if we do accommodations without ADA involved, particularly if the employee takes advantage of those accommodations?
Vaughn, would you mind popping on and just kind of explaining that a little bit in more detail?
Yeah, I mean, just going back to what Bessie was bringing up too, like I'm fearful if we say, hey, I'll accommodate you.
Yeah.
But then, I mean, employees take advantage of things all the time.
Yeah.
And I don't want a supervisor saying, yes, I'll accommodate you from, I don't know, weeks here and there.
Yeah.
But then they stop showing up for work because you're like, you told me I can work remotely because I can't walk. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I'm just afraid of that situation because it has happened with our staff and employees before.
Yeah. Again, it's really just determining whether or not the ADA even applies. right? So if the ADA is not applied, there's no reason an employee would come through me, because I'm not even going to pursue the interactive process because they're not eligible for the ADA. And so it's determining whether or not their work restrictions and the department's response to those restrictions actually creates a scenario where they have a disability. That's really what it is. The fact that they can't walk is not necessarily a disability. It's only going to become a disability if it impacts has a longer term impact on their activity, on an activity of daily living, right? They can get to work, so they can ambulate to work. They can do the job if we allow them to do that. But if we say they can't do it, well, now we've interfered with their ability to work, which basically creates that disability, and then we're going to have to go through the interactive process. So I would hope in most instances, if you're saying you can't accommodate an employee's return to work restrictions, chances are you're probably not going to be able to accommodate their ADA either, because we should be making those decisions based on the same scenarios for all intents and purposes. But there may be exceptions to that rule. And so again, if you want to reach out, I'm happy to discuss those with you to make that determination.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Yeah, I don't want you to do stuff that's going to make you uncomfortable. So that's what I'm here for. I'm happy to help out. And then if you gain a level of comfort after the first few times, I'm good with that. How do departments deal with the temporary versus permanent disability? What is time threshold, if any? It's hard to answer, to be honest with you. It's has to do a lot with what the disability or what the restriction is. And then what are the essential functions of the job and how long can the department tolerate, or should I say, how long the department can accommodate it before it becomes an essential or it becomes an undue hardship. So if we're talking about very short duration disability, like for instance, in that scenario where I get a return to work release, but I can't lift more than 10 pounds for X number of whatever, but let's say I work in our animal care services, if there's nothing else that they can give me to do, then at that point we're saying, well, we can't have you do, we can't accommodate you with this restriction full time. Well, now we've created a disability, or we've now checked that box that says, all right, it interferes with an activity of daily living. Now it's a disability. But when it comes to ADA, we probably still won't give them 40-hour accommodate, say we can comply with this 40 hours a week, but oh, you can't lift more than 10 pounds, so you can't do these functions, but they may still be able to do the other functions. And so we may look at the possibility of going, well, we can get something versus nothing. So what do we want to do here, and go from there? All right. I know I talk in a lot of circles when it comes to in parables, kind of when we're talking about these kinds of things, but it's because there's a lot of variables. And without knowing exact specifics about jobs, what those essential functions are and what have you, sometimes it makes it hard to give specific answers. So I'm sorry. All right. Moving on. So responding to those accommodation requests, just kind of jumping in on this. We want to make sure that we're responding to those requests, at least the initial request, in a timely manner. Okay. And we'll talk a little bit more about timeframes here when we get into the interactive process. Respond in writing. No matter whether the employee says it to you verbally or not, respond to them in writing. The reason being is if things ever go south, it just gives us the ability to provide something that says, hey, we told the employee that they may be eligible and that these were the resources that would allow them to do this. Okay. It also comes in handy sometimes when we're doing unemployment. So just know that. Keep the request confidential. Don't discuss it with anyone who does not have a need to know. This is probably the most important, right? We don't want to insinuate. We don't want to go to another employee and say, well, so-and-so's apply for an accommodation, so now you're going to have to do their job. Those aren't the kinds of things we want to do. So you want to try and keep that circle to as small as possible. If you need to talk to your HR, to the supervisor, or if the supervisor wants to talk to you guys about it, they're more than welcome to do that. In fact, I've actually recently asked if I could start including HR contacts by default on all terminations at a minimum. Some of your departments are really good about, it's the HR person that actually coordinates a lot of these things. The supervisor reaches out to the HR partner, and the HR partner is the one that's actually coordinating with me. Bonus. But that's not the case for everybody. So, and I understand that. Temporarily accommodate the request if possible. That's a big one. If you have the ability to temporarily accommodate it just while we're going through the interactive process, I promise it does not mean you're going to be locked in the box that says you have to keep doing it. Okay, so if an employee says, I need to work remotely, if their duties will allow them to work remotely for half-time, but they need to be on site the other half-time, offer that up and say, hey, look, I can let you work while we're going through the interactive process to determine, you know, your final accommodation. I can let you work that half-time. Just understand that continuing that beyond is going to be dependent upon, you know, the accommodation process. So you guys do have the ability to do that and to temporarily make those accommodations if you're able to do it. And sometimes when we actually engage during the interactive process, we'll talk through that a little bit. Please, please, please don't ask for any type of personal or medical information. The second one, we're a medical institution, and I have seen this. We want to make sure that our folks are not trying to diagnose their employees that may work for them. I understand that sometimes they may be experts in whatever particular thing and that the employee may have volunteered information, but generally it's going to be the word of their healthcare, the employee's healthcare provider, that's going to carry all the weight. All right, we generally don't have an avenue to challenge what the healthcare provider is saying. And then last but certainly not least, you know, as I mentioned earlier, don't be afraid to reach out to your supervisor or me for assistance. And understand, as I mentioned, I'm the only one for accommodations. Sometimes it may take a little bit of time for me to get back to you, but we'll talk a little bit more about how long that might take coming up. So let's go through a really quick practical exercise. Let's think through this one. If you guys want to unmute, you're more than welcome to talk through it. Crystal, let me get to your question. Let me pop back up here and jump to these questions really quick. I have an employee that says she can't take manual blood pressure because she can't hear. Does this need to go to ADA? Yep. I would definitely refer that one. Okay, so an employee has been having attendance issues. And during the performance discussion with their supervisor, the employee states that they have been having a hard time sleeping due to sleep apnea. So my first question is this a request for accommodations? Should this supervisor provide this employee with information about the ADA? Yes or no? What do y'all think?
My thought is that it's a solvable issue. I mean, they could find a solution with their healthcare provider so that they can solve the actual issue and they're not oversleeping or whatever the issue is. Because it sounds like an accommodation would be something like they can come in late when they're not actually solving the issue or showing that they're solving the issue is what I'm thinking out loud.
Okay. Anyone else have any thoughts? All right. Betsy, I like where you're going with that. I think for me, I think you're right in terms of when we got to the point of the accommodation, we would probably be looking very, very heavily on that this is a situation you could probably solve outside of an accommodation. But I think out of an abundance of caution, I would probably refer this one.
Okay.
Just because the employee is telling us that we know the employee has an issue, right? They're having attendance issues. The employee is saying that they're having a hard time coming in because they haven't been sleeping well, which kind of underlies this is why I've been showing up to work late, and I have a medical reason for that. And so I think just out of the abundance of caution, I would probably refer this one. I mean, I think you're absolutely right in terms of where it will go, but I think I would do the referral.
I'm curious what an accommodation for that would look like. Would it just be an altered schedule?
Possibly. Yeah, it depends on what the healthcare provider says. I mean, if the healthcare, maybe they have a CPAP and they're still having a large number of events. Not very common, but it can happen. Maybe it's not just obstructive. Maybe it's some other things CNS related, that there may be more to it than just the apnea because we don't know what that underlying cause is. So once we got the documentation from the healthcare provider, we would probably have a better idea. But if we got something that basically says, well, yeah, it's this, and this, here's the issue, I suspect that would probably be what it would be, looking at whether or not we could adjust their schedule so maybe they come in a little later and they leave a little later.
I know you said with privacy with the ADA, can I assume like a supervisor would never see that medical paperwork, I imagine? Okay, just
Yeah,
want
you guys won't even see it.
right.
So the paperwork, so believe it or not, so, you know, those of you that have, my background was leave, before I was doing ADA, I was doing leave. So, the information that we can request for FMLA and family is actually considerably more, expansive than what we're allowed to request for the ADA. Really, the only thing I can ask for when it comes, and if you've seen, I think most of you have probably seen our documentation form, right? It literally just asks, you know, what's the condition? They don't have to give me a diagnosis. It just, here's the condition. Here's the activities of daily living it impacts, and here's the limitations it creates, and here's what we recommend as accommodations that will allow the employee to overcome the limitations. Now, I will tell you, if an employee has a visible disability and their accommodation requests are consistent with that visible disability, I'm not going to ask for documentation because the ADA would slap my hand. So, but it's generally what we're going to do, this request is going to be for invisible disabilities that aren't visible. And that's where we need that additional documentation, or in situations where we have an individual with a visible disability, but the accommodation request has nothing to do with that visibility.
Well, interesting.
Yeah. All right. So yeah, I think in this particular instance, I would probably do that. I would probably do it. All right. Kind of along those same lines, let's see, we have an employee who's on FMLA or family and notifies their supervisor that they're going to need additional leave after their 12 weeks of FMLA or family are already exhausted. Gus has already answered that one for us. So I think we can just go ahead and move on. So thanks for that, Gus. I'm actually really glad you brought it up. All right, so let's get into the interactive process. Are there any additional questions about what is a disability? What does it look like? What does the request look like? And how do I respond to the request? If
It
claiming,
looks like we have one in the chat from Meg.
Meg, if claiming a medical condition, do they always need a doctor's sign off or just asking for FML time? So we have a couple of different policies that govern that, right? So if you're gonna use sick leave, I think we've got a policy that if you're gonna use your sick leave for more than a certain number of days, you do have to provide some sort of medical documentation. I know for the FMLA, they're gonna need something from a healthcare, a licensed healthcare provider that's acceptable. Essentially, that list is a little smaller. But when it comes to the ADA, it's a much broader range of individuals that can sign off on it, but it does have to be a licensed healthcare professional. You know, and there are such things as conflict of interests. So if we're a medical institution and if I work in the Department of Neurology, I'm probably not going to be able to have another provider in the Department of Neurology sign off on my documentation if we have a close working relationship. Okay, because that would be considered a conflict of interest. Yeah, 4 days. Thanks, Dana. I couldn't remember if it was 3 or 4, so thank you. All right. So the ADA interactive process is essentially the ongoing communication between the employee and the department and the ADA coordinator to determine what accommodations are needed and whether they are reasonable. I like to call this a negotiation, even though I don't like the word negotiation, because for all intents and purposes, we're trying to get at what the employee's limitations are, determine what they absolutely have to be able to do, and then what can we do to allow them to overcome those particular limitations and satisfactorily perform the essential functions of their job. All right. Now, employees a lot of time want specific things, right? And it's great. I'm happy to take their wants into consideration. And where their wants overlap with the limitations and what we're able to provide, fantastic. But sometimes there are situations where they may want one thing, but another thing will essentially allow them to overcome their limitations and will be more beneficial for the university. And so that's what we're going to give them. Okay. The key is the reasonable accommodation allows them to overcome the limitations. It doesn't necessarily have to meet all of their desires. Does that make sense? And the example I like to give for this, not that we would ever do it, is let's say I have a back problem. I can't sit for long periods of time. And so I ask for a standing desk. I get my documentation. I want this particular standing desk. It goes up and down. I can vary the height. Okay. But my limitation is I need to stand up to work. Technically, we could get some cinder blocks and stick it under the desk they have to turn it into a standing desk. And we've met the requirements of the ADA because we have provided an accommodation that will allow them to overcome that limitation. Does that make sense to everybody? Now, I'm not saying we would do that in every single instance, but it's something that we can consider. All right, so let's talk about the interactive process itself. So several different steps in the interactive process. Generally, the first one is what we've already identified is that the employee actually makes that request for accommodation. The second step is that we refer that employee over to ADA somehow or another. And then that is where we're going to pick up here on this slide. So generally, the first thing that's going to happen is the employee is going to have 15 days to return any type of paperwork. I'm going to meet with the employee, okay? If I don't already have documentation from their healthcare provider and I need that documentation in order to substantiate their request or to continue with the interactive process, I'm going to give them 15 days to do that, okay? Outside of that 15 days, then essentially I'm not going to stop the department from pursuing whatever they need to pursue. Okay, now it doesn't necessarily mean we won't halt that process that the employee actually submits the documentation, but by and large, we give them 15 days to respond. Once they submit that documentation, then I will generally do my best to reach out to that employee within 5 business days. Okay, now, as I mentioned earlier, I'm the only ADA coordinator for employees on our campus. So depending upon my caseload, depending upon how my conversations with the department and the employee are going, sometimes that can take a little bit longer. But I always try and get it done within 5 to 10 days. Okay, 10 days at the max. So when I meet with an employee, I'm going to do exactly what I said earlier. I'm going to make sure that they understand that the purpose of the accommodation is to allow them to perform the essential functions of their job. Okay, that's number one. I'm going to ask them what it is that they need. What limitations are they having? Generally, and the way I usually will do that is I'll say, what do you do on a daily basis? Tell me about your job. Okay. Now, tell me about how your health condition is impacting your ability to do that job. Oh, okay. All right. So you're not able to do this, you're not able to do that. So what you need is something that's going to allow you to do X, Y, Z. Yes. Okay, great. Now I've got that documentation. Okay, from them. Next step is it something that's a visible disability that everybody can see and that we can easily relate to their request? Yes, great. We move on. If no, then this is where we do that pause and I say, all right, well, thank you for the information. I'd like to collect some additional information from your healthcare provider. Could you please have them fill out this form and get it back to me within 15 days? Then we stop that clock, okay? I'm going to be looking, once I get that documentation back from the healthcare provider, do those two things marry, right? Is what the employee is telling me similar to what the healthcare provider is telling me? Sometimes the answer is no. Very, very rarely though. Most of the time, those two things overlap. In fact, sometimes it looks like the employee filled it out and the doctor just signed it. So if you have any inroads with doctors, tell them not to do that. Have them fill it out on their own accord. Okay, but we also tell that the healthcare provider, and I'm working on some additional documentation and instructions to go with that form that essentially tells the healthcare provider what we're using that form for and gives them a little bit more structure around what to put on it. Okay, and how to fill it out. All right. Because it really is important that we get accurate information from them. So once I get that form back, then I'm generally going to set up, I've already met with the employee. Once I get the documentation form from the healthcare provider back, I'm going to meet with the department, right? And we're going to talk about what the essential functions of that person's job are, okay? What are the things they absolutely have to be able to accomplish? And we'll talk a little bit more about what an essential function is here in a bit. But we're going to talk about what those essential functions are. All right, great. Now I know what the things they have to do are. Here's the limitations. And then we're going to start looking at how can we address those limitations and still allow them to perform those essential functions. Okay. Now, there's some tips and tricks to that. We're going to talk about those on another slide. But the biggest and most important thing in doing this is to keep an open mind. All right. There is a difference between things we want and things that we absolutely have to have. So we may like people being in person. We may not think it's fair that one employee would be able to work remotely and another employee has to be in the office. But what we're going to solely be focused in determining whether or not something is reasonable is, will it allow them to perform the essential function? And if working remotely will let them do that, it's going to be reasonable. Okay, and sometimes that's where we get hung up. I'll be honest, when I'm working with supervisors, that's the number one place we get hung up is the supervisor doesn't like the idea of letting someone do something. It's not the way they want to run their shop, or it's not the way that they want to run their processes. And so we always just try and redirect it back to, what do the essential functions of the job require? And can this accommodation allow them, will this accommodation allow them to perform those essential functions satisfactorily? Essential functions. So just keep that in mind. Once we've kind of had that conversation, if what we can provide differs from what the employee's request was, then I'll generally go back to the employee and have another conversation with the employee and say, look, we've talked about these things. Here's the issues that we're having. What else can we do? We're not going to be able to accommodate this particular request. Is there something else that we might be able to provide? Or a lot of times we'll have already determined what that other thing is, and I'll offer that to the employee and say, look, we can't do this, but we can do this. Is that something that you think would be acceptable and that you would be able to do? And if they say no, well, we're probably just going to issue the letter anyway that basically says we can't accommodate what you're asking for. This is the alternative we discussed. You're not able to do that, but and then it's up to the department to go ahead and continue forward with whatever process they need with my colleagues here in the employee relations and performance team. Okay, so it is kind of a back and forth. It's a circular pattern where sometimes we have to go a little bit backwards and then go forward. So sometimes there can be a lot of different conversations involved. It's not always, we had a conversation with the employee, we had a conversation with you, it's done, we're moving on. Sometimes we do have to go back and revisit those things, and it may take 2-3 conversations. And sometimes I might need to get other folks involved. So there have been situations where, me and the department have not been able to agree on whether or not an accommodation was reasonable. And so we get the legal office involved, and I'll generally consult with one of the attorneys, and then that attorney will consult with the department as well. So just sometimes it takes a little bit of time. After we've determined what the accommodation is going to be, assuming we've agreed on an accommodation that's going to require the department to do something, then it's going to be up to the department to seek approval for ordering or providing the funding for and actually carrying out and implementing the accommodation. So let's say we agree to buy an employee a new chair. It's going to be up to the department to ensure that the chair is purchased and to make sure that the chair gets to the employee. Okay. I will say that I've been doing quite a bit of consulting on that lately, and I've been learning a lot of those processes, and it's just so interesting to me. For those of you that are involved in them, it's very, very interesting to me how some of those processes work. If we can't order the furniture from Staples, even though it's a heck of a lot cheaper, we have to order it from one of the furniture vendors where it's 4 times more. So see, Deanna's laughing. She knows, she gets it. Yeah, so just know that there may be some additional hurdles there, but and I'm happy to help where I can in those, but sometimes I may just need to refer you out to the procurement service center and have them get back to you. All right, and then once we've completed that implementation, we're not necessarily done. All right, we've provided the accommodation, but those accommodations are kind of living, breathing things, right? We're constantly monitoring to make sure that they're still working for us. Employees may have different kinds of health conditions, and as those health conditions progress, their needs may change, right? So they may need to revisit that accommodation as that health condition changes. They may not need the accommodation anymore at all because their health condition has changed. And we do ask them to get back to us, or I ask them to get back to me when that happens. Do they always do it? No. But that's the other reason that we have the department monitoring, right? So the needs of jobs change over time. I was hired as the ADA coordinator. I also do pregnancy accommodations as well as religious accommodations now. So my job has changed. We expect that's going to happen as funding changes due to the nature of funding of the legislature and all sorts of other things. That employee's job may change. So we may, as a department, may need to revisit that accommodation because maybe it's not allowing them to perform everything we need them to do. So just know that that's a possibility, and you guys are always more than welcome to initiate that conversation with me and revisit those accommodations. All right. So jumping into the actual essential functions of an employee's job, when we're assessing what those essential functions are, there's three things we need to consider. The first thing is does the position exist to perform that function? There's two types of functions, essential functions and marginal functions, okay? Essential functions are the reasons the job exists, the things that absolutely have to be done, okay? So does the position exist to perform the function? Secondly, how many other employees are available and able to perform that function? And kind of in line with that, how much skill and expertise does it take to perform the function? Okay, so, and we're going to go through another little example here where we're going to kind of flesh this out a little bit more. So a team of 4 custodial employees is responsible for cleaning a multi-story building overnight. One of the employees wears the prosthetic leg, which enables him to walk very well, but climbing steps is painful and difficult. The stairs and the steps in the building have to be cleaned. So let's go through this process and looking at, does the position exist to perform the function? His job is to clean. So, okay, well, we're saying, but is cleaning the steps an essential function? Maybe. The position exists to clean, so cleaning the steps, okay. How many other employees are available and able to perform the function? Well, and then at the same time, how much skill and expertise does it take to perform the function? Well, I'm cleaning the steps. So chances are every member of this 4-person team is probably capable of cleaning the steps, right? So is this an essential function of the employee's job? Yes or no? What do you think? Is cleaning the steps? You think so, Sheldon? Who else? Nobody. All right. Don't be afraid, folks. It's okay. I get wrong answers too. All right. So the answer to this is, I don't think so. And here's why. Okay. He's one of 4 people that are capable of doing this job, right? All 4 can do it. We understand it's a big building, most likely. They probably all have little things that they need to do. So let's say there's a break room. More often than not, there's probably a space that's going to need to be cleaned that might be able to be moved to the employee that can't clean the stairs, and the employee that would normally clean the break room would clean the stairs instead. So the work is still getting done, right? And because there's someone that can easily do it without interfering with their ability to perform the essential functions of their own job or to perform the cleaning functions of their job, and it doesn't take any specialized knowledge to do it, I would say probably it's cleaning is an essential function, but cleaning the stairs themselves is not. And so we could easily accommodate this employee by just essentially flopping that duty around. He cleans one thing and the other employee cleans the stairs. Does that make sense?
Can I ask a quick question?
Sure.
In this scenario, right? Let's just say that cleaning the stairs is the least favorite part of anybody's job. And now you're excluding one person of the cleaning team from doing that job for equity purposes. Would that like interfere with like his accommodation?
No, because he has an accommodation. The other employees do not. Right? So if we talk about equity, this guy's missing a leg. I'm just saying, the other guys have them. So,
Okay.
but yeah, from an, I get where you're going with that one, and I think that's a legitimate question. But a lot of times the ADA is not really concerned with what's fair, or, I mean, I guess you could say, is it equitable? Well, they all have the same amount of work to do. They don't like to do this particular work. So equity, from an equity perspective, they have the same amount of work. It's just one has to do a task that the others don't, and maybe they rotate through but this person is excluded. And it's because they have the accommodation, and that's gonna happen, right? It's the same thing when we have, an employee that their job allows them to work remotely, but we want the team here. We want them on campus. Well, the essential functions allow the work to be done remotely, which means this person has a need to work remotely due to a documented medical condition. So they're going to be able to do that, and the rest of the team members may not be. And we have that a lot. In fact, it's a sticking point with a lot of supervisors. It's not fair to my other team members. I understand that, but the ADA is not really concerned. They're just looking at, do the essential functions allow it to be done remotely? Now, nothing wrong with the supervisor going, well, you know what, look, we've already determined that this stuff can be done remotely, so we want to move the rest of the team out to work remotely, so everybody gets the same thing, right? For retention purposes, or for, I champion that argument in a minute. All right. Other questions related to this one? If that comes up between supervisors, Jen, that's a good question. It comes up between the supervisor employees. Can the supervisor just say this decision was made to meet specific workplace needs? Yes. You're a supervisor. You don't have a requirement to explain your decisions to anybody except for your supervisor, right? You don't necessarily have to explain anything. And I'd prefer you didn't. It's easy to say, it's really none of your business. And we can leave it at that.
So for instance, with this employee, let's say we assigned him to do cleaning toilets or something, and he felt like he was being punished for not being able to do the stairs. What would the response for that then be?
This is how we can accommodate your needs. All of these things need to be cleaned. You all need to do the same amount of work. We can have another employee do the stairs, but you're going to need to take up on this other duty instead. And back to Gus's original point, maybe they hate doing the toilets and the stairs. So the guy that had the toilets gets the stairs, and this dude gets the toilets. So it's still technically equitable because he was going to have the stairs that nobody wanted to do. So, yeah, I think that's how it may not be desirable, but it's part of the job. Anyone could have to clean the toilets. It's part of the job.
Makes sense. Thank you.
You're welcome. And again, it doesn't stop him from rotating other individuals through those particular duties. And maybe they don't have to do the same crappy duty all the time, but this employee would be excluded only from the things that he can't do because of his limitations. All right. So tips and tricks, we've talked about this a little bit more. Like I said, keep an open mind. I mean, it's really, really, really important when we're thinking about these things to kind of think outside the box, right? And I generally will tell people the easiest way to kind of get in that mindset is to start by giving everyone a blank slate. Now, a blank slate may not necessarily be warranted in every situation. And we talked about that a little bit earlier, where if we have an employee, well, actually we did. If let's say we have an employee and they're asking to work remotely 3 days a week. Well, if they're currently working remotely 2 days a week and they're not performing the essential functions of their job, they're not getting that work done that needs to be done, I think we could probably make a pretty good argument that allowing them to work additional days remotely was probably not going to allow them to perform the essential functions of their job. So that might be something that we would not be willing to accommodate, okay? But outside of those types of scenarios, generally performance is not going to come into play. That's why my team, I'm part of the employee relations and performance team. Brad Mathers is my boss. I work with all the ERP partners. We're all on the same team. We have a tendency to talk quite often. But we will generally keep those two processes, the performance management process and the accommodations process, separate for as long as we can. Now, I will tell you that I do ask employees when I meet with them whether or not they have any outstanding performance issues or whether they've had any performance issues. It's helpful for me to know going into the conversation with the department because it helps set my frame of mind. But where we can, we want to try and take that blank slate approach to where I know it's hard to kind of weed out some of those biases and those expectations, particularly when we have problematic employees. But if we focus solely on the accommodation, the limitations, and what they've asked for, and then last but not least, what the essential functions of the job are, we're generally going to be okay. Again, assessing what's preferred versus what's essential. right? Do I do something because it's the way I like doing it? Or do I do it because it's the way I absolutely have to do it and it's the only way it can be done? Okay. We all get set in our ways. We do jobs for long periods of time. We do processes in certain ways for a long, long time. And it's hard for us to think outside of that process or the way that we've always been doing it. And so there are times I've seen in different court cases that I've read where the employee filed a complaint, the EEOC authorized the suit, it went to court, and then what saved the employer was that the employer had gone, to others and said, hey, assess this process. Let's look at this process. How are you doing that? Oh, you're having the same challenge as I am. There's not really another way to do it. And the fact that they had done that additional digging and they had brought in that additional kind of brain trust kind of to go through that saved them. And in one particular instance, it was actually a medical resident. It was a resident that wasn't going to be able to do some of the requirements of the residency. And they had asked for a reasonable accommodation. The unit had denied the accommodation, but before it denied that the university had denied the accommodation. But before they did that, they actually put together a small group of other residents and providers to look at that process and go, how else could we do this? And ultimately, they determined there wasn't another way. And therefore, they weren't going to be able to accommodate. And that's what saved their bacon, really, when it came down to the lawsuit. Was that they had done that. Had they not taken that additional step, there would have been more room for the court to find fault. Even though the end result was still there was no way to do it, how do you know there wasn't another way to do it? You didn't check, so you didn't really perform the reasonable accommodation process and the interactive process to standard. Okay. We already talked about thinking outside the box and engaging others to do so. That's kind of what I was talking about with that particular scenario I just gave. Follow up. This is the important one. Look at whether the accommodation is working. Manage the employee's performance. If there are issues with performance, take that back to ERP and start that performance management process. Don't let the accommodation hamstring you because, like I said, the purpose of the accommodation is to allow the employee to perform the essential functions of the job. Right? And that's what it's all about. Okay, now, everything I have just said is what the ADA says. There is absolutely nothing in the ADA that says you can't go further, right? So, if there is no requirement for you to remove an essential function, but there's nothing that says you can't, you're welcome to do that. But if you do that, here's my warning, be consistent. Because if, for instance, you have a research associate that you say is the only research associate on a particular grant, and therefore they can't work remotely because they have to be in the lab to do XYZ tasks, you can do that. And we can deny the accommodation. But if you do that, and then you have a PI, a faculty member, who is the PI managing all of these projects. They're the only PI managing all of these projects. And then that PI needs to go out and you say, oh, well, we can let him go. Now we're not being consistent. We said that this other scenario that was almost the same situation, well, pretty much the same situation, if not, PI is more important, I'd argue, in a lot of instances. Would be unreasonable. You can't now go back and say, well, this particular one is reasonable. Okay, so consistency is a very, very, very important part of this as well, right? Because institutional memory, we're going to be tracking part of what I'm working on right now. In fact, it's probably going to go live tomorrow, so I'll just give you guys a sneak preview. We are changing the accommodation request process. We are going to make it an online process where an employee is actually going to be, this was the way, those of you that have been around since the Denver days, from what I understand, this is the way that it was done when we were joint with Denver. But essentially the employee is going to go online. They're going to fill out their request online. And that's going to allow us to track a lot of things. We're going to be able to automate some things, but it's also going to allow us to track a lot more things and to kind of make sure that we are being consistent as an institution. Okay. And do a little bit more of a deep dive in that other than just Stephen pulling out files left and right. Like, what are we doing this? What are we doing that? All right. So the managing performance is the last piece of those tips and tricks, because it's important to do that. All right. Done with the ADA. Are there any additional questions about the Americans with Disabilities Act as amended? One little piece I'll throw out there, it was actually a slide and I took it out. And it's because we're doing some transitions in terms of those of you that does anybody attend the ERP 101 class every year? If you do, you can sleep through my section because this is going to be a lot of what that is, minus the scenarios. One of the things that's kind of interesting in this is that the ERP actually, or the ADA actually has roots in Denver. Does anybody know that? July 5th, 1978, two important events that impact ADA on our campus occurred. One, I was born. No, I'm kidding. But, well, I was, but it didn't really impact. And the second is that the Gang of 19, which is a group of disabled individuals, actually got together to block RTD buses downtown to bring attention to the fact that it was very, very difficult for people with disabilities to ride the bus. There were very limited transportation options in those days. And we think about that now, it's like, it's ludicrous. Every single bus we know drops down, wheelchair ramp comes out. That wasn't the case. A lot of disabled individuals could not use public transportation in the late 1970s. And so this Gang of 19 got together and blocked all the buses and drew national news attention to this. So that was one of the opening salvos in the battle for individuals with disabilities. Now, unfortunately, it took almost 2 decades for them to get the ADA to be signed into law, but then it was and then another decade for it to be updated. But eventually we got where we wanted to go. So that's the additional, the more you know information about the ADA is that it has origins right here in Denver. So, all right, Pregnant Workers Fairness Act. The PWFAs, and I'm using the plural form for one reason, and that is because there is actually a federal law and there is a state law as well that coincides. Okay. Colorado actually had had a state law that covered pregnant workers well before, several years before the federal government did. But just know that's the reason I'll generally say PWFAs. They are very, very, very similar. The only thing's difference is timeline. The state law allows these accommodations to go longer than what federal does. Okay, so that's kind of the important, not really that important, because we're really just going to be focused on the state when it comes to that. But other than that, they're essentially the same thing. But it provides reasonable accommodations for any limitations related to, affected by, or arising out of pregnancy, childbirth, or related medical conditions. Okay, that's the definition. It's a lot like the ADA in a lot of ways, but there are some key differences. The request and the interactive processes are essentially the same. Okay, we just have a separate form right now. There's a separate paper form. In the electronic process, employees will still go to the exact same place, and depending upon what option they choose, that will determine what they have to complete and the information that they're provided. So it's interactive, but other than that, they're going to have the same processes. The primary differences are that the PWFAs apply to applicants and employees with no limitations, whereas the ADA only applies to individuals with disabilities. The bar for a disability is considerably higher than a limitation. Okay, so it's going to be much easier for an employee to get a pregnant employee to get an accommodation for a limitation than it would be for a disabled employee to get an accommodation under the ADA. The PWFAs are also a bit more flexible when it comes to essential functions. There are scenarios where an employee may be entitled to an accommodation under the PWFA, even though it would prohibit them from performing an essential function of their job. Okay. And the reason for that is because pregnancy is finite, right? We know in these situations that it's going to be a finite amount of time that we're going to have to provide the accommodation. So assuming it's a finite amount of time and that there is some way for these things to get the things that they're not going to be able to do to get done, then there's a possibility that they would be able to have that accommodation, even though we would have to remove an essential function from them in order to do it and put it off on someone else, which we already do anyway, because when an employee goes on leave, we have to figure out how we're going to redistribute their work. So it's kind of the same thing. Okay. So that's primarily where they're different. It really just is how easy it is to get the accommodation. And last but not least is just where are the essential functions, whether or not the essential functions matter. All right. So Pregnancy accommodations a little bit different when it comes to what's reasonable. Some of these are overlap, some of them are a little bit unique. More frequent long break periods. That's generally what we see. People just need a little bit more time to rest. More frequent restroom, food and water breaks. The ability to actually have food and water at their workstations, right? Or the ability to actually go to that. So we have a lot of lab space. And we can't necessarily have my peanut butter crackers at my bench, right? So that employee needs to be able to, one of the accommodations may be that that employee has the ability to travel back and forth to an office or someplace that's where the food can be so that they can snack and they can drink water throughout the day. Okay. Acquisition and modification of equipment and seating, limitations on lifting. I can't lift more than 15 pounds, so I'm going to need somebody to help me if I've got to go in and do that lifting. Temporarily transferring employees to a less strenuous or hazardous position. Yeah, maybe we hired to work in a BSL 3, and now I'm pregnant. I don't want to work in a BSL 3. Well, that's an essential function of your job. Yeah, maybe, but we might need to take that away that functions for that period of the pregnancy. Job restructuring, light duty, and then last but not least, flexible scheduling and remote work. And so those are all the things that we consider as we're kind of going through that process to determine whether or not accommodation will work for that employee. All right. Any questions about the PWFA? Y'all, for all intents and purposes, the process is going to be just like it is for the ADA. The only difference is that the fact that something is an essential function probably won't matter. Okay, if we can figure out another way for someone else to do it or it to be done otherwise, then chances are they're going to get the accommodation. All right. Let's do this last exercise. This kind of rolls everything up into one nice, neat little present, puts a bow on it. So an administrative associate's having attendance issues. The 5th time that she's late, she goes to her supervisor and tells her supervisor that she's pregnant and has been experiencing morning sickness. So let's walk through this process. We know that this is a request for accommodation because the employee has had an issue. They're not showing up on time. We know that they have a condition, they're pregnant, and we know that they have had, it has been impacting their ability to satisfactorily perform the essential functions of their job. So looking at this one, does this look like something we would refer the employee for ADA or PWFA? Yeah, that's right, Sheldon, PWFA. Thank you, sir. I saw it. We're good. All right, so yes, we're going to encourage this employee to apply for an accommodation in the PWFA. Now, is that going to stop us from having a performance management discussion with this employee about their attendance? No, because the employee didn't tell us that she was pregnant until the 5th time that she was late. And we understand that sometimes you want to keep those things quiet, or a lot of things can happen during a pregnancy. But if it starts to impact your ability to show up on work on time, you might want to let somebody, hey, look, there's some things going on, let me go talk to. So at least the employee, the supervisor can give you the resources that you need and refer you to the people you need to talk to. But in this particular instance, the employee didn't do that. So I think the expectation would be that, yeah, we would probably want to work with our ERP partner to have a performance discussion around that employee, or with that employee about their attendance, but and kind of help them understand what should have happened, and then let them know that, they can reach out if they're concerned that this is going to continue to be an issue, that they can reach out. Now, it's going to come to me. I'm going to look at it and we're going to talk about, hey, employee, what are your limitations? The employee is probably going to tell me it would be great if I could come to work later in the day. Okay. So they're not even asking to work from home. They're just saying, can I show up for work later in the day? Does that seem like it would be a reasonable accommodation? Maybe. What does the employee do? What are their administrative duties? So let's say this employee is responsible for manning up the front desk in the dean's office. Is there anyone else that can man that can sit at that desk and perform this employee's functions so that for those 2 hours that they need to be out? Yeah, I know, Allison. Thank you. It's actually true, though. It doesn't just impact morning. But in this situation, you know, there's probably going to need to be more discussion around that. Right? We're going to need to know specifically what the employee's duties are. But let's assume that this employee does sit there. We do have someone that can sit there. The supervisor can sit there for 2 hours in the morning, and we can accommodate this employee showing up to work 2 hours later and then working 2 hours later. Well, there's nobody there in the office that's going to be coming in the front door at the end of the day. Well, but it doesn't impact the employee's ability to be there and still get other things done. Right. So chances are it'd probably be reasonable. But what we were trying to tie up in this one is it was a request. We still need to do the performance management, right? What are some of the accommodations that we could provide based upon these criteria? And then what are the things that we're going to think about when we're considering what's essential? Okay, so that was kind of the purpose. Any additional questions about this? I'm going to open the floor up to all of you and let you ask any questions you might have of me. Feel free to play stump Stephen. I'm totally fine with that. If I can't give you an immediate answer, I will jot it down and I'll find an answer and come back to you. So what else are you guys interested in? Is there anything that you were hoping to learn from this you didn't learn from this, and something I need to include when we teach this in the future?
Stephen, I have a question about, it sounds like the accommodation is monitored. Is it working? I just was curious if the letter that says an accommodation has been granted has a date range, or if it's assumed to be, most of them are indefinite unless it's not working out, something like that.
That's actually a really good question. So it's really kind of dependent on what the accommodation is, right? So if the department, for instance, says, we can accommodate this employee working remotely, but we can only do it for this much longer. That finite period is going to be in that letter where we're saying, yes, you may have a lifelong condition, but we can only accommodate you doing this for this long before it starts to create that undue hardship for us. And so we're going to put that in there. And so if the employee is not able, and we see that with restriction, when we do have those situations where we have employees that come back from FMLA, but you know, the Gus's scenario, they've come back from FMLA, they're out of their accruals, they have restrictions. We can accommodate that for a period of time, but we can't do it indefinitely. And so we will generally put that date in. Same thing if the employee, though, if the employee's condition is temporary and we're accommodating, we're still going to put that date in there. And so this date is expected to end. So if something changes, you're going to need to come back and we're going to need to revisit this. Okay. And just understand, we may not be able to go beyond that. Now, one thing that all of you can do, and I'm kind of hesitant to say this, so I would tell you, don't do this on your own. I'm going to throw it out there. Just don't do it on your own. Just be sure that you're consulting with me before you do it. But when an employee goes out, if we know that they may need an accommodation when they return, we can actually do an assessment on the front end to determine what is reasonable. And we can just put that out to the employee at the very, very beginning, so that we essentially have the ability to say, based on this is what we can accommodate. We can't go beyond that. And so when we get to the end, that employee says, well, I can't come back. Well, we've already told you that this is the extent of your accommodation. At that point, we would just be able to, we wouldn't have to go through the hoops of going back through the process. We could just essentially do the leave exhaustion or whatever at that point, if that makes sense. But back to your original question, yes. If we know that there's a finite either accommodation period or need for the accommodation, we're going to put that in there. If it's a lifelong if it's a lifelong condition and based upon the requirements of the job right now, we don't foresee the need to terminate it, it's just going to be open. But we always have the ability to reassess that.
Because I know with family and FMLA, with that fitness to return form, it might give a date and then we need a new one to show if the accommodation or if the restrictions have been cleared or if they've changed. So that kind of got me thinking about this, if it kind of changes different time periods, if there's different accommodations, or like I said, if there's an end date on it.
Yep. Yeah, there can be. That's,
Thanks.
and we'll generally try and do that. And we also, I don't have problems with when we say, we're gonna trial something. Sometimes we're not sure if it's gonna work or not. We think it will, but we don't know for certain. Or we're not, or we don't think it will, but we'll give it a shot, right? We can't say for certain it won't. In those instances, then generally what we'll do is that we'll do a trial. My trials are generally not anything less than usually 30 days. There've been a few exceptions to that because of extenuating circumstances, but we'll trial it for 30 days and see if it works. And if at the end of that trial it doesn't work, and we have to end the accommodation and look at the possibility whether we can do anything else or not at that point. But I don't have a problem with working that in as well.
Thanks.
Any additional questions about the ADA or the PWFA or religious accommodations? Since I know we didn't talk much about those, but if you guys have any questions, please let me know. Easy audience.
Thank you so much for coming. If you guys can fill out the evaluation form, we have that so we can collect data on our Elevate series, that would be great. It looks like there's one more question. What is the implication if the department didn't follow the ADA or the PWFA?
Yeah. So
Lawsuit?
yeah, well, maybe. So generally, the first thing that's going to happen is the employee is going to file an EEOC complaint. EEOC is going to send an investigator. They're going to do an investigation. Sometimes that investigator will determine that the solution can be remedied without suit. So essentially, we may get fined, but we will be able to essentially provide the accommodation, whatever that may be. If we separated the employee, we may have to rehire them. We may have to provide some sort of severance or some sort of payment that's to the employee. But if the EEOC investigator determines that it was a blatant violation or that there was malicious intent or something of that nature, then they may authorize suit. This is one of the weird areas where you can't just outright sue us. The EEOC has to authorize that suit, but it happens. It happens quite frequently. And so I try and stay on top of those just to see kind of how case law works. But it's different in different areas. We're in the 10th Circuit. And I know other circuits, like for instance, with time off, right? Additional time off as an accommodation. The 10th Circuit is pretty tight about that. It's what they allow us to look at the total amount of time the employee's been out. So if they've used 4 months of FMLA and now they're asking for another month, it's not just 4 months that they're asking for us to accommodate. It's our 1 month for us to accommodate. It's 5. It's the 4 they've already been out plus 1 more, or the 3 months rather for FMLA, plus 1 more. So we get to consider that entire time period when we're assessing whether or not it's reasonable. Whereas in other circuits, you wouldn't be able to do that. In other circuits, they're very, very particular about it, but none of those cases made it to Supreme Court yet. So we just still kind of make our decisions around what the 10th Circuit does. And just so you guys know, anytime we're going to deny a request, I will run those through legal. We've not disagreed yet, but it's just important that I have another set of eyes to look at them, so it's not just mine. But if you and I have agreed that me and the supervisor have agreed that we're not going to be able to accommodate something, I will actually take one more look at it just to ensure that they're comfortable with it. Okay, but we generally won't do that if we're approving it, or if we're a lot of times with partial denials where maybe we can't accommodate all of this, but we can do some of it. Most of the time we're good with this as well. But anytime we're going to outright deny an accommodation, we'll always run it through. All right. Any last minute questions? Well, thanks so much for listening to me yak for the last couple of hours. I really, really appreciate it. If you do think of anything else, let me know. If you have specific scenarios you'd like to talk about, feel free to email me and we can go through those if we have time. Deanna, will you make sure that I get a copy of those course evaluations?
Yes, sir.
And if you think of anything else that you'd like to comment on the course, you talk too much, you talk too fast, anything like that, feel free to let me know. Because it's constructive feedback for me, because I suspect I'm going to be doing this considerably more often with other units on campus. So I appreciate it. All right.
Great. Thanks, everybody. Appreciate your time. We'll see you next month.
Bye all.